It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. The two main parties battle it out on the campaign trail, hoping their pitches will cut through.
I want to lead the most pro-growth, the most pro-business Treasury that our country has ever seen.
The only certainty you're going to get with the Labour Party is that they're going to run out of money and put up your taxes. As clear as night follows day.
The Liberal Democrats trying to put clear blue water between them and the two main parties. Nigel Farage gives his verdict on the campaign so far.
Two men with the appearance and enthusiasm of middle managers vying to become our national leader.
We'll be joined by Reform's Lee Anderson later in the programme. And could a policy of national service encourage young people to serve with the military? Joining us today, hopefully in a few minutes' time, the Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride, Shadow Environment Secretary Steve Reid, Sasha O'Sullivan from Politico and Gitto Harry, former Downing Street Director of Communications. This is Politics Live. Welcome to the first full week of campaigning in this election 2024. Let's get a flavour of the campaign trail with the two main party leaders. We have our political correspondent Ione Wells on the bus with Rishi Sunak, and Ian Watson is travelling with Labour. Let's start with Ian. What have they been up to today?
Well, as you can see, Joe, behind me, a massive turbine at the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby, perhaps an appropriate backdrop for Rachel Reeves to announce that under her, if she becomes the actual Chancellor and not the shadow Chancellor, then the Treasury would become an engine of growth. So this is all about a speech which was pro-business. There's business people in the audience, 120 business people, some of them former business people, had signed a letter endorsing Labour's current approach. So she was quite chuffed about that. But she also wanted to emphasise that Labour would keep a tight grip on the nation's purse strings. That was aimed, of course, at any floating or wavering voters. But after her speech, she was asked, of course, about what the Conservatives were up to. This, as you'll probably hear more from Ione on this, of course, but this idea of a pensions triple lock plus, taking state pensioners out of tax. Interesting enough, she didn't absolutely dismiss the idea, but she did say it was a gimmick. The Conservatives couldn't be believed, and while she'd love taxes to go down, she said that she wasn't going to make unfunded spending commitments. So you heard it here. Let's make sure that we keep her to this pledge. But she said the forthcoming Labour manifesto will be fully costed, no ifs, no buts. But I think the Conservatives are trying to a whole range of policies to try and make that task all the more difficult for her.
Ian Watson there on the Labour campaign. We'll go to Ione Wells in a few minutes' time, who is following Rishi Sunak. But as you heard there from Ian, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has delivered her first major speech of the campaign, addressing business leaders this morning in Derby. Let's have a listen to a little bit of it.
I want to lead the most pro-growth, the most pro-business Treasury that our country has ever seen, with a laser focus on delivering for working people. Today, more than 120 senior business leaders have signed a letter expressing their support for a Labour government.
Rachel Reeves obviously referring to this letter that will have come as a welcome, obviously, to the Labour Party. How important are those sorts of endorsements on campaigns like this?
They're very good for morale. They're good for, playing with the heads of the other side, if you like. And traditionally, they wouldn't be queuing up to endorse Labour. I think it's slightly more significant on this side because it has been a weak spot for Labour for a long time. And so to have this kind of endorsement on that particular issue is very helpful. But in the end, it doesn't tell us what exactly would happen in practice. And if you want to see what a Labour government is like when it comes to economic growth, look at London, look at Wales. It's not a great story.
Sasha, what do you think? Yes, it may have been a while since business leaders as a group have endorsed Labour, but it really is a feather in their cap, isn't it?
I mean, this is the product of years of lobbying and years of work from Rachel Reeves, laying the groundwork, trying to make the case that actually Labour is the party that will put investment, Labour is the party that will listen to business, and over the last 6 months or so, the reason that she has made such a big case for not having any kind of unfunded tax cuts, or that, you know, we heard her say that again today in her speech, is there was this real animosity towards the Conservatives that was built up during the kind of brief period of Liz Truss. There was this sense of, we actually don't know the policies that are going to come out. And a lot of what we've heard is that she won't put herself behind anything in particular that doesn't have the costings.
There were no new policies mentioned in Rachel Reeves's speech, some underlining of things she's already announced. At the moment, what's the difference between you and the Conservatives?
Well, what we saw today from Rachel was a clear sign of just how much Labour has changed since the last general election in 2019. If you can bring business back to Labour, you can bring growth back to Britain. And Rachel is standing up there, putting forward, with Keir Starmer across this election campaign, a plan to grow the economy after 14 years in which we've flatlined, and we've got over 120 captains of industry endorsing Labour's approach because the Conservatives have failed, and that's why we've seen so much cuts in public services and so many big tax rises under the Conservatives. They've had 14 years and the economy is flatlining. It has to be time for change.
I mean, if there's anything that highlights what Keir Starmer and what Steve has just said, that the Labour Party has changed. You can trust us with the economy. I mean, there's a broad spectrum of business leaders who have signed this letter, including some who did not support Labour under Jeremy Corbyn. You have to admit that that's where the party's changed.
Well, no. I mean, there is no signatory from the CEO of the FTSE 100 companies on there, for example, unlike back in November when Jeremy Hunt came forward with the largest corporate tax cuts in modern history.
So you're not disappointed? You're not disappointed that you've got the former Heathrow Airport chief executive, the former Wagamama chief executive, the JD Sports chairman, and the Wikipedia founder. So they don't matter.
No, of course everybody matters in this debate. I accept that. But the point that I'm making, getting back to Wales, is if you look at Wales, which Keir Starmer has referred to as the blueprint for Labour, where they are in government, through the business rate system at the moment in Wales, if you're running an independent cafe or restaurant, you're paying £6,700 per year more than you are in England, where rates.
But what does it say about the Westminster government, about these businesses' view of the Westminster government? It says we've lost faith.
OK, so we have brought in huge support for business, the biggest tax cut with full expensing to drive investment that in turn is driving growth. We've now seen the UK economy expanding this quarter at the fastest rate, joint fastest rate in the G7. Real wages rising for 10 months, inflation coming down strongly.
But you admit it hasn't cut through. It hasn't cut through with these
levels.
businesses.
And as I say, in November, in fact, we had a letter which had 200 names, not 150, and also had big major companies in the FTSE 100, their CEOs firmly backing our approach.
Is there a price to pay, though, Steve, for this improved relationship with many business leaders? Because over the weekend, Sharon Graham from the Unite Union described your workers' rights plan as having more holes than Swiss cheese. You have already watered down two key policies in those workers' rights plan in order to have a better relationship with business. That's the trade-off.
The new deal will actually be the biggest boost in workers' rights in the workplace in a generation. And the reason for doing that is it's pro-business as well as pro-worker, because strong functioning industrial relations, a real partnership between the workforce and the employers, is how you drive growth in the economy. Now, one of the reasons the Conservatives have failed so badly on that, we've just had the worst decade for wage growth since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and we've got the highest rates of personal taxation for 70 years since the end of the Second World War. That is abject failure. You've got to have a new approach to industrial relations. You've got to have a new approach to growth after 14 years in which we've flatlined, and that's why they've ended up whacking up taxes in the way that they have.
But that approach to growth and labour relations is French-style changes, scrapping our trade union laws, which are about stopping and controlling the level of strikes. Under Labour, we will see an explosion in the level of strikes and poorer industrial relations.
I think your government delivered that. I mean, are you against fire and rehire? Do you support fire and rehire?
Small and medium-sized enterprises should be quaking in their boots at the kind of French-style
Although, just out of interest, Mel, the minimum services legislation that you brought in hasn't been used.
Sorry,
the minimum services legislation hasn't been used.
The point is, it is there and it can be used.
But it hasn't been used. There's no sanction for them not using it.
That is a factor when it comes to...
It hasn't worked.
Because it's
we have
unworkable.
balanced thresholds for strikes, etc. Now, if Labour diminish all those and take those away and scrap them, as is being urged by Unite and other unions on the left to the Labour Party.
Steve, are you going to?
Well, I conclude from this that the Conservative Party is in favour of fire and rehire, which is where you sack your workers, reduce their pay and conditions and then bring them back. But that is the kind of change Labour is offering to workers. It's the Conservatives that allowed fire and rehire to continue in the way that it is.
Don't talk over each
I don't think you should oppress working people
We've got
like
low
that.
unemployment.
You don't get economic growth that way.
Much lower than in France. Almost half.
We've got lower economic growth.
Almost half what it was.
Is this what we're doing here, having a comparison with France?
Under the last Labour government. No, because our policies are working. We're getting unemployment down. We're getting employment levels up. Growth is up joint first in the G7.
This isn't what the captains of industry are telling us, Matt.
Hang on. Let's talk about... You've mentioned strikes, so let's just talk about strikes. Would you say that the last few years have been characterised by strikes across all sorts of parts of the public sector and industry? Has it been... Right, OK. Right, so the industrial relations issue have been poor, haven't they?
Well, we have been...
Have they been good or have they been poor?
Not back at the levels they were in the 1970s, but we have had increased industrial relations, which have an impact. And that's why we have legislation in place. And that's why you have to get that balance right between workers' rights and actually having an economy that functions.
It's unworkable. Your legislation would have resulted in nurses and doctors being sacked, and nobody wants that.
No, well, it wouldn't. And
what's the expectation, do you think, from business in terms of a Labour government if they win this election? Rachel Reeves has said she will keep a cap on the 25% level of corporation tax for the entire Parliament. What will they want to see?
I think the expectation from business, and I think that's, what the watering down or the changing of the workers' deal has basically said to businesses, we will have this fight further down the line. There will be a conversation, there will be a negotiation over certain bits which businesses were concerned about, have been concerned about over the last 6 months, things like zero-hour contracts, and they've left it open to interpretation. And so they're basically saying, the letter from 120 business leaders, there is a sense of them kind of hedging their bets a little bit. And I think it's interesting that the attack line has been from CCHQ that, OK, well, no FTSE 100 CEOs have come out and backed it. They don't tend to do that in an election. They say we want this policy or we want that policy. They don't say these are the people we want to be leading the country.
Right. I mean, in terms of the expectation from business...
There's a little bit of that, isn't there? Which way the wind is blowing, and every day they're told that Labour are, a slam dunk, they're going to be in power, and therefore you want to be, in with a new gang. You don't want to be out with them. But there's also another thing, and I remember from last time this happened, I even did a piece on it because I worked for the BBC at the time, called Omerta. There was a vow of silence from the trade unions not to embarrass a Labour government that was trying to sneak in, looking like a Conservative government, sounding like a Conservative government. Gordon Brown, the original Rachel Reeves.
But you would back that.
You can trust me. And they all keep quiet, and then the moment they're in, it's, there's an agenda. And of course there's an agenda.
Steve?
If there isn't an agenda, what is the point of changing the captain of the ship if the captain of the new crew just wants to do what the current crew wants to do?
Sharon Graham from Unite might take issue with the idea that she's been in any way quiet.
Should we go through all of them?
What's actually gone on here is there have been negotiations going on between Labour and the captains of industry and with the trade unions so that we can get to a balance that will work to grow the economy. The new deal will scrap things like fire and rehire and exploitative zero-hours contracts where people don't know how many hours they're going to get paid for from 1 week to the next, so we can get certainty back into their lives. But the good industrial relations that breeds promotes business investment and business growth as well. It's what you want to turn the page on economic flatlining.
And people don't want a trade union getting involved in deciding how much they want to work and where they want to work.
A government should foster good industrial relations, not industrial strife like the Conservatives.
But do you accept that campaigns are about floating voters, about undecided, about voters wanting to feel safe, and that Rachel Reeves does that?
Absolutely. She's done a terrific job of reassuring Conservatives that they have less to fear from a Conservative government than what history sort of tells them and their gut instinct tells them about everyone else behind her.
Right, let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Keir Starmer, in an interview with our political editor, I am a socialist who will put country before party. What does it mean to say I am a socialist, Steve?
Well, I mean, I understand it to mean an economy in a country that works for working people with a strong society and support for our democratic institutions. And I think that's the right thing. But country before party is a very important part of that sentence as well, because we've had a Conservative Party fighting each other rather than fighting for the country. And it's another reason why we need to turn the page and start to rebuild Britain with a new government.
Does that put people off, do you think, the word socialist still, if you are a floating undecided voter? Or does it show how confident Keir Starmer is to come out and say, yes, I am a socialist?
I think it is a risk for Keir Starmer to come out. I don't think it's a massive risk. You know, the conversations we've been having this morning about the definition of a kind of social democrat or a socialist or a Christian socialist, I think are largely academic, and they're not the kinds of things, as we were talking about undecided voters, the things that we're going to end up talking about are 0 hours contracts, how that affects self-employed. You know, pensions triple locks, what that means for older voters. Whether or not Keir Starmer is a socialist, I don't think isn't going to be the deciding factor.
Sentiment is important, though, isn't it, Mel Stride? Because Boris Johnson, who you used to work for, once said F business. Was that helpful? Is that sort of approach helpful? Right.
Nobody can say that was helpful. But listen, we're not talking about Boris Johnson, we're talking about Rishi Sunak and this general... Look, it's telling, the question that you've just asked about who is Keir Starmer. You know, what does socialism mean? When he says that, what does he mean? This is a man who on 2 occasions supported and extolled the apparent virtues of Jeremy Corbyn to be the Prime Minister of our country. Jeremy Corbyn, a man who wanted to pull us out of NATO, go down the route of unilateral disarmament and abolish the army and our armed forces, which are there to provide security. Now, it's a long journey, is it not, from the Keir Starmer of that time to whatever we currently think...
Well, let Steve respond.
Do you know what? Jeremy Corbyn was ditched as a Labour MP by Keir Starmer, and now he's been expelled from the Labour Party and is standing against us.
Hang on, let him answer.
Liz Truss, by contrast, who crashed the economy, has been welcomed back as a Conservative candidate by Rishi Sunak because he's too weak to take her on. And the fact that he's too weak to take on the extremes in his own party is why he's too weak to guide the economy and stabilise it and get the growth that can make people's lives better.
When it suited Keir Starmer to back Jeremy Corbyn and all those things that he
Do you think Liz Truss should be standing for the Conservative Party?
When he went through the leadership contest, he made all sorts of pledges, which he accepts he's now U-turned on.
I think
actually no. What we need are debates.
Weekly debates. What they do.
All right, we'll come on to the debate. We'll come on to the debates in a bit. But as you said, Mel Stride, let's not talk about previous leaders like Boris Johnson, as you were saying, or Jeremy Corbyn for now. Let's catch up with Ione Wells, BBC's political correspondent. She's on the campaign bus following Rishi Sunak. Ione.
That's right, Jo. We've just come from a visit with the Prime Minister. He was in Stoke-on-Trent at a pottery factory meeting employees there and talking about some of the Conservatives' plan in this election. Now, Stoke-on-Trent is an interesting seat coming up in this election because it's an area where the Conservatives won some new seats in the 2019 election under Boris Johnson. This is an area which really the Conservatives need to try and hold on to if they are to avoid big losses, these so-called sort of red wall seats that were gained from Labour in the last election. So I think that's one of the reasons why he's up in Staffordshire today campaigning in some of these areas. We're told as well that he is due to be meeting some pensioners later in the day somewhere else in the area, and I think that will be to talk about this new policy that he's announced today. Essentially, the idea that as well as pensions now going up in whatever is higher out of inflation, rising wages and 2.5%, they will now also be rising the threshold at which pensioners pay tax to the same amount, effectively meaning that people's sort of state pension wouldn't end up being taxed. Now, they argue that this is a way to sort of protect pensioners, give them, in their view, a tax cut. But it has drawn some criticism, particularly because the reason that some of those pensioners would have started paying tax in the first place was because the tax thresholds have been frozen. That was a Conservative policy, and it does mean that lots of workers who pay tax are potentially either being dragged into paying tax for the first time or being dragged into a higher tax rate, which some are seeing as a tax rise for workers at a time when they are also making that cut for pensioners.
Ione Wells, thank you there on the campaign bus. Yes, let's just show you what Ione has been talking about. Headline in The Sun, Rishi's election offer, gold age pensioners. What is the offer?
So the offer is we are the party that introduced the triple lock, which is just being described, which means that pensions have gone up by £3,700 since 2010 because we believe in looking after pensioners. We're going still further now with the triple lock plus, which means the personal allowance, which is the amount you can earn without paying any income tax, is going to also increase by the triple lock amount. What that will mean is that those who are relying on the basic state pension will not have to pay income tax into the future. In fact, millions of pensioners will save hundreds of pounds in tax. But what?
All right. Well, hang on. Let me just because we're going to have a discussion about it. And the reason that this policy has been brought in, presumably, is to correct the adverse impact on pensioners, some of them having to pay tax because of frozen tax thresholds. Who froze those tax thresholds?
After the COVID difficulties that we had, the economy shrank by 10%. We had to support the economy.
You did. Just
with
say, yeah,
COVID,
you did.
etc.
For whatever
and so
reason,
we had to put up some taxes in order to pay back the £400 billion.
Some taxes. Freezing tax thresholds since 2021 has been one of the biggest issues and policies that has meant we're all paying more tax.
So my point is that the £400 billion, which was about protecting people from the inflation imported from the Ukraine war and the COVID and so on,
I understand.
had to be taxes had to rise. They are on a downward trajectory, not just for pensioners, as we're announcing today, but also for 29 million workers up and down the country, where taking a third off national insurance for workers is saving the average worker.
But Melson, just to be clear to people, what you're doing is
Yeah.
introducing a policy that is trying to correct some of the adverse impact on pensioners who have started to pay levels of taxation because you froze the tax thresholds. That's right. What this is. It's a corrective.
You start with tax wherever you are at that particular point in time. What we are saying is that as a direct consequence of this triple lock plus, pensioners will save hundreds of pounds that they would otherwise have had to have paid in tax. As a direct consequence of Labour dismissing this, what they are saying is that millions of pensioners will now be pulled into paying income tax going forward. It's basically a retirement tax that Labour are now bringing forward.
Why are you dismissing this policy out of hand?
Well, first of all, I noticed that Mel's not telling us how they'd pay for it, because it's yet another multi-billion-pound unfunded commitment from a party that's already made. Rishi Sunak's already made with his national insurance commitments a £46 billion unfunded spending commitment. Now, when Liz Truss tried that, it caused a run on the pound. It sent mortgages shooting up. It sent rents shooting up. Prices in the shops shooting up, and she had to be dismissed as Prime Minister after 46 days. And they want to do the same thing again. The truth is, Mel, if I could just finish my point, this is a party that keep telling us, the Conservatives, that they're in favour of cutting taxes, and they use that as a veil to cover the fact that they're actually whacking them up. We've got the highest levels of personal taxation since the Second World War in 70 years. The last budget, which they claimed was cutting taxes, froze tax thresholds that pulled a lot more people into paying tax. Now they're trying to make another reckless and desperate commitment here that they can't tell us how they would fund.
Pensioners. That's what we're doing. You're going to tax
tell us how you would even fund it.
You are going to have millions of pensioners
let him respond.
paying more tax under a Labour government, aren't they? And also filling in all that red tape and the forms and everything else and paying income tax. Be honest about it. Now, on this unfunded tax, unfunded spending...
How are you going to fund it?
So, well, we're going to fund it with £6 billion that we are going to bring in by clamping down on tax avoidance and evasion.
Surely if that had been there, you'd have done it by now.
It's curious, because Steve tuts about this, but the Labour Party are also saying they'll do exactly the same.
Well, that's true.
We say... You have 14 years and you're not
and
able to
indeed, we
close
have a
those
much
loopholes.
better record than Labour on doing exactly that.
Well, all right. Let me bring in.
than under Labour.
What's your response to this announcement in terms of the Conservatives obviously going after their core vote?
I mean, you asked how are they going to pay for it. We know how it's going to be paid for. We're all going to pay for it. It's what you talked about with the fact that we've all been dragged into higher tax brackets. That, you know, fiscal drag is worth about 26 billion or something massive like that. And it is a core vote. And the over 55s are one of the kind of last bastions of the Tory vote, and a majority, they're the people who turn out to vote in a majority of constituencies. And this it's an election campaign. The triple lock on the pensions has been controversial for the last 6 months, for the last year. Adding an extra layer to it just makes it more controversial.
I mean, what about working people? I mean, these freezing of tax thresholds have affected working people too, and this won't do anything for them.
I'll tell you what drives me nuts, Joe, is hardly anyone outside a small group in the Conservative Party wanted us to lock down for less or to lock down lighter. They all advocated, and it happened in Wales, lock down for longer, shut down as much as you can, kill the economy, and then we're surprised. We're surprised when we spend £400 billion and we're arguing, here over a few little rounding errors. 400 billion was spent. That has to be paid back. There is no magic money tree, to quote someone else.
But the choice is who pays it back.
Well, Labour or Conservative. The honest answer here is that there are decisions that have to be taken to clear what was a decision taken with almost universal support from the British population, that we locked people down to keep them safe. Now, going forwards, that's where instincts come out. What are Labour's instincts? Traditionally, to spend more for noble reasons, for moral reasons and all the rest of it, but that's the instinct.
Not in this election.
What are Tory instincts? Instinctively, over decades and decades, they think that people are better at spending their own money and controlling their own lives. That is the ideological divide, traditionally, for hundreds of years.
But traditionally, of course, that was then. Now we've had the highest tax burden for some of the reasons that you've said. Yes, for some of the reasons that you have outlined. But just briefly, because we've got to move on, would you unfreeze the tax thresholds, either of you?
Well, those matters more generally across the piece are matters for both of our parties to come out. They're not for me to opine on your programme about. But we do believe that with pensioners, we should make sure that they're not paying tax or indeed getting pulled into taxes.
Except you were the ones who have ended up with them paying tax. That's the point. Would you unfreeze tax thresholds?
The key to lowering tax, and we want to lower tax because it's far too high on working people and pensioners now, the key is economic growth. Yeah. And you only get that with economic stability. So what Rachel was talking about today was tough fiscal rules as the foundation for growth, but then looking at how we can cut energy bills for households, looking at how we can build
Do you have a manifesto commitment that there will not be a global pandemic? Do you have a manifesto commitment that there will not be war in Ukraine? Because that's the only way you can make that
the economy
promise.
was flatlining before anyone had ever heard of COVID-19.
Well, you left us with no money, with the note that
all right, and that's back to
no money
2010.
left.
But actually, one of the points is,
already.
if you dismiss their policy out of hand, pensioners will be paying more under Labour.
There'll be millions of them paying tax.
The reason we're in a position where you've got such a high tax economy is because it's been such low growth. And with the Labour government, it grew at 50% more every year on average. We need to get back to growth, to cut taxes. With the Tories, it will just be 5 more years of the same failure. High taxes, low growth, low spending.
While you're doing your campaign lines, let's just move on to this in The Guardian. Tories' National Service pledge was sprung on candidates, says Minister. Was it sprung on you? Were you fully briefed about this policy?
I was aware that there was a policy being developed. I think it's a very good policy. I think it's a bold policy. And in a general election in which people are looking for a government that's got a clear plan, a clear sense of direction, bold, forthright policies, I think, matter.
Well, are you surprised about how badly it's gone down with some of your colleagues, including Steve Baker here?
It will always generate debate, but I think this is a great opportunity. They do it in other countries for 18-year-olds to get the experience, to get those connections, the self-confidence, the skills, etc.
Yeah, all right.
As the basis.
Well, let's have a look at some of the polling. I mean, according to YouGov's polling from September last year, just 34% of people support a compulsory year of either community or military service, with 56% against. If you're more than 20 points behind in the polls, you say you had heard or you were aware that there was a policy. Is this really the thing to spring onto the electorate to turn things round?
Well, it's your expression to spring on it, and policies.
No, not mine. Steve Baker, the government minister. I didn't use it.
Policies have a moment where they're not known about, and a moment when they are known about.
Hang on. Well, of course, Theresa May did the same with social care, and it didn't work very well in that campaign.
Look at what's happening in other countries here. So look at Sweden, okay, where they have a similar kind of approach. 80% of those young people that go through their arrangements come out saying they would actively promote participation to their friends. That is a prize that we can achieve.
I'm not saying that the policy isn't good or might not work. It's really the process by which to use Steve. But let me just show you his tweet. I don't like to be pedantic, he says. He's a Northern Ireland minister. But a government policy would have been developed by ministers on the advice of officials and collectively agreed. I would have had a say on behalf of Northern Ireland. But this proposal was developed by a political advisor or advisors and sprung on candidates, some of whom are relevant ministers.
Well, no, the way it works in a general election is parties come forward with a manifesto. The contents of manifesto commitments are not known in advance, whether you're in government or not. So it's a quite normal process for there to be a moment in time when something is not known and then it is announced, and that's been done in the normal way.
What's wrong with
the triple lock plus?
Yeah,
is exactly the same situation.
Well, I mean, obviously they're different policies, but what's wrong with the policy in principle?
It's yet another unfunded commitment, isn't it? From
Well, but what's wrong with the policy in principle, though?
I'll explain where the money's coming from if you want me to.
The Conservatives have shrunk the army down to its smallest size since the Napoleonic Wars, and you're not going to correct that by creating a teenage dad's army. One of the military leaders, former military leaders, said more or less the same.
Hang on.
This is not a solution to the problems we're facing in this country. Labour's going to recruit additional teachers by closing the VAT loophole on private schools. That is a way that you can help young people. We're going to set up youth hubs, funded by closing the non-dom loopholes in every community. That is how you help young people. Conscription into the army is just going to make the army more difficult to manage.
About 5% will be going into the military side. There'll be a competitive exercise. People that want to be there have to compete to get those.
Johnny Mercer's against it. He's in the cabinet.
Don't brand this as a wholesale conscription exercise.
Johnny Mercer's against it. The Veterans Minister is against this. Say no more. Their campaign's in chaos.
There's been a lot of pushback from within Conservatives, but on the principle,
on the principle, it's a good one. And of course, it's not going to just come off the shelf in the middle of the heat of a general election battle and turn into workable policy overnight. But in principle, do you think it's a good idea to give young people a stake in society, to teach them skills, to give them a sense of purpose, to lock them into activities? For instance, during the COVID lockdown, I was taught how to deliver vaccines. Imagine if you had an army of 17-year-olds ready to go out there and help vaccinate people next time something like this happens. Take food and shopping to old people, not to mention military skills. We don't need the kind of army we had to fight Napoleon. We're not going to fight the next war with ships and with sort of men in trenches. It's a different kind of thing.
Do you think it'll appeal to young people?
Well, some people it will appeal enormously to, and frankly, to those it doesn't, it explains why we need to lock them in, why we need to drag them out of their shells and lock them into something purposeful.
Sasha?
I think the fact that we're talking about locking in 18-year-olds and dragging them off the shelves might explain why there's some kind of reticence towards it. You know, the paper that initially put together this policy for national, well, it's been around for a while, but one of the more recent papers about this said, yeah, there was a lot of support for national service, but when it was optional, and it is, when you're kind of forcing teenagers to do stuff, I do think kids want to have some kind of buy into the country. They want to feel like they're heard. They want to feel like they're doing something useful, but when they're essentially being forced to say, you know what, if you have a job on a weekend, you won't be able to do that. You'll effectively have less freedom than you otherwise would, and that's not a particularly Tory thing to be doing.
Right. I mean, was this policy designed to appeal to young people, or was it designed to appeal to perhaps older voters who might be looking at reform as an alternative?
Well, we're doing it because we believe it's the right thing to do for the future of our country, giving young people all the benefits of what this particular approach will deliver. We know, as I've said, that in Sweden it's had extremely positive outcomes by the very people that use it. And on this point about mandation, there are many things that we mandate. Education and attendance at education. Being educated is one of them. That's why, apart from anything else, we've got some of the best improved education in the Western world under this government. So,
Steve?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that a lot of young people are not participating in society in the way that we'd want them to be, or education or employment, is high levels of mental ill health, and Labour's proposals to put mental health counsellors in every school, funded by closing the VAT loophole on private schools, is probably a better way to support those young people to participate than conscripting them.
Well,
right.
No, but why would going out and having people working actively in the community at a young age, working with their peers, learning leadership
That's great, but Matt, have you met an 18-year-old?
Why would that be bad for your mental health, Steve? Why wouldn't that be a good approach?
Because you're not actually tackling the mental health.
During COVID,
I'm very in favour of...
Well, let him answer your question.
I'm very in favour of giving young people opportunities to engage in their community communities and to volunteer. We need to support that. Schools is a good place to do that, but you've stripped them of the support to allow them to do those extracurricular activities. Labour's proposals for additional teachers will give them the support they need to go out and do that. Conscription isn't the way to do it.
Right, let me talk about discipline on the campaign, Gitto, because the party, I'm not saying particularly about you, the party has had to suspend Lucy Allen MP for endorsing a Reform candidate to replace her. Now, I've mentioned Steve Baker once. He's making a big appearance on this programme, but he's cross because he didn't want to cancel his holiday plan, so he's gone to Greece while the campaign is ongoing. And another person who doesn't seem to be hitting the campaign trail is your old boss, Boris Johnson, also caught by surprise by the snap election announcement. Would he have been an asset on the campaign trail?
You just made it sound like a whole bunch of things are going wrong. I mean, the first woman you mentioned is already gone. She's a past MP. She's not standing. She's left the party.
But what about the answer to my question on Boris Johnson? Would he have been an asset?
Left Number 10, hounded out by his own people to a large extent, and then left Parliament, kangaroo court, whatever. We don't need to revisit that. But he's no longer an MP nor a candidate. So why are we surprised that he's not around?
Well, because he was planning to. So we'd heard, maybe being asked by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, would he have been an asset?
Well, it's a marathon, not a sprint. There's about 5 weeks to go, isn't there? And he will help a few people in choice places, I've no doubt. And guess what? You can work remotely at the moment. Mel is doing a great job of saying there are 2.8 million people out there who, just because they can't go into a factory doesn't mean that they couldn't do a useful job that would help them have a purpose in life. He can do useful things abroad, but it's not his fight anymore. No. He won the biggest victory in 40 years, back in 2019. He's done his bit for the party. The fact that that has been lost and squandered and forgotten is...
I think it's disrespectful to go off on holiday when the election has been called. And that surprised me about some Conservative MPs. I cancelled a trip to France so I could be out here launching my campaign in my constituency and taking part in the campaign. I think it's very odd to think you can do it from a beach in Greece.
Right, well, let me just show you this in terms of discipline within the party. BBC News headline, Diane Abbott, Labour race row probe finished in December. This investigation into comments that Diane Abbott made about race, it was finished, the investigation, apparently in December. What's been going on since then?
Well, I'm not privy to those conversations.
But should you be? Should you be? What could possibly have been going on between December and we're nearly in June and there is still no decision about Diane Abbott and whether she'll be able to stand as a Labour candidate?
The Labour Party has its own processes for dealing with those kind of issues and MPs are not involved with them, and that's exactly as it should be. I don't know what conversations have been had with Diana since then or how they've gone. I do recognise Diana's been an absolutely trailblazing MP. She has a record generally to be very, very proud of, but there was this incident and it needs to go through the process. It'll be resolved in the next few days because we'll be getting to the point where we need to know who the candidates are, and both parties currently are taking those decisions.
I think this is a total cop-out, and I don't think the other side would ever get away with this. This is a woman
with what?
Who was a groundbreaking MP, who should be on a pedestal in terms of Labour politics, who was turfed out over something she said, quite rightly, but this investigation was concluded, apparently, 6 months ago. The number of times Keir Starmer, the leader of this party, the man who tells us that he will be in charge if he runs the country, tells us he has no idea that she was cleared. He doesn't understand why she's not back in the party. Really? How are we to trust him on anything if he doesn't know what's going on
under our disciplinary process? It's not MPs, not even the leader, who takes those decisions. We have a process. I don't know what conversations have gone on since December. Has the leader asked the question, where's the process gone?
But
it will be resolved within days.
What is happening to Diane? Why is she languishing on the back benches?
It will be resolved within days. It will be resolved.
Well, she may not be languishing, but she's languishing as an independent. All right, let's catch up with what Reform have been doing, because you will have seen Nigel Farage, who is the honorary president of Reform, at a campaign event. We're going to talk to Lee Anderson. He's been on a political journey, to say the least. Former coal miner who worked for a Labour MP, then stood and won Ashfield in Nottinghamshire in 2019 as a Conservative. In March, he defected, becoming the only MP for the Reform Party. Welcome to you, Lee Anderson. We've asked all candidates, or rather all MPs, as they are still, of parties when they first appear on this programme, to give a sort of 30-second pitch on behalf of the party. What would yours be on behalf of Reform?
Well, first of all, I didn't defect to the Reform Party. I was kicked out of the Tory Party, then joined the Reform Party as an independent MP at the time.
Noted.
But I think Nigel's been quite clear this morning on what Reform's policy is on immigration. It's the #1 issue on the doorstep: illegal migration and legal migration. We saw back in 2010, I think legal migration was around 200,000 a year. And now it's currently at about 700,000, 600,000 net over the last 2 years for each year. So the government has failed on that, and people, quite frankly, up and down the country and in places like Ashfield, are absolutely fed up with being promised one thing and something else being delivered.
Leander, what is Reform's plan to stop the boats crossing the Channel?
Well, I mean, Nigel said it this morning. Richard Tyson has been very, very clear on it. I've done some media early today. You know, and when I was a Conservative member of Parliament, I was quite vocal on this subject in the House of Commons. And it's quite simple. It's turnbacks, it's pushbacks. And if the illegal migrants actually slip through the net and get here to the beaches in Dover and on Kent, then just scoop them up, you know, look after them for a few hours and take them back to France.
Right.
It needs political will.
Yes.
It needs courage. It needs strong leadership. And I'm sorry, nobody in Parliament seems to have that.
Right. I mean, Leander, we looked into this a few months ago when Richard Tice was on the programme, and there are legal problems with it. Otherwise, it would have been done before. As you say, and we heard from Nigel Farage, you're expecting France to take asylum seekers back, or people making that crossing in small boats. If it was that simple, it would have happened. It can't.
Well, look, I mean, the French, we know the French Navy are actively escorting these boats to the halfway point and passing them over to the RNLI. And I say send them back. And if it causes any sort of incident or people are bothered about our international reputation or breaking any international laws, and so be it.
Really? So you're prepared? Well, hang on, Leander. You're prepared to break the law. You're prepared.
There is nobody in Ashfield lying awake at night worrying about international laws or treaties.
All right,
they want this problem stopped straight away.
I understand. So you are prepared to break the law if it's maritime law, and perhaps to have some sort of conflict with our neighbours in France.
Conflict with France?
Well, I don't mean armed conflict. I mean just a battle in terms of over the law.
It's the French Navy that's causing this conflict. They should not be escorting these boats to the halfway point in the Channel and dumping them to us. They've got a lot to answer for.
Right, and if the policy is so appealing, were you surprised that Natalie Elphicke, the MP for Dover, which is certainly at the sort of front line, if you like, when it comes to this issue, chose to defect to Labour and not to Reform?
Well, I mean, that's up to Natalie. I mean, I was surprised that she made the move. She has been quite vocal on the subject, but, you know, they're welcome to her at the end of the day. I mean, as an MP for Dover, yes, she's been vocal, but she's achieved very, very little. Look, and there is another solution to the illegal migrant, and this is going to probably get me into some sort of hot water again with you lot in the media. And I said this to a previous Home Secretary, I won't say which one, but if some of these migrants do land on the beaches, let's take them to a remote Scottish island somewhere, out at Hebrides, where nobody lives, give them the building materials, let them set their own camps up, and I'm sure they'll be safe and free from persecution in war-torn France.
Right, well, that is just inflammatory rhetoric. I mean, we don't know. Scottish island, to take migrant to a Scottish island. All right, we'll just park that just for the moment. I mean, Nigel Farage is the best-known sort of potential candidate Reform has, and he isn't even standing. You must be disappointed.
No, I'm absolutely delighted, and I'll tell you why I'm delighted, because if Nigel was standing, he would have to spend the majority of his time in his own seat campaigning and attending hustings. Now we can come to places like Ashfield, which he is doing later on this week, and help me retain my seat.
All right, Lee Anderson, we have Mel Stride and Steve Reid in the studio. Mel Stride, listening to what Lee Anderson said about the policy of the government in terms of its utter, complete failure.
So on illegal migration, I don't accept that what we should be doing is invading France's territorial waters in the way that Lee Anderson. Well, it's tantamount to that. You're talking about returning people. It wouldn't be with certainly wouldn't be with their agreement, would it, Lee? To get into that kind of friction with France would mean that the 26,000 illegal crossings that have been prevented by cooperating with the French would then, presumably, that cooperation would be completely ripped asunder. The way that we stop the illegal crossings is by smashing the model that the criminal gangs that are operating this operate. And that is to have a deterrence, which is where the Rwanda policy comes in.
Flights are taking off during this campaign. We'll never be able to test the policy.
We have the aeroplanes ready, we have the airfields ready, we have the people doing the processing. We are ready to go. The Prime Minister made it very clear when the legislation went through, this is important, Jay, that this would happen within about 10 to 12 weeks. So this will be happening around July time. Those flights will be taking off to Rwanda. We've seen it with Albania.
Lee, just because I've only got a few seconds. Lee Anderson, if those flights take off, will you deem the policy a success?
Well, look, I mean, I've got the greatest respect for Mel, but I think he's been, a little bit dishonest here. The reason that Rishi Sunak has called this election, he knows full well that these flights will not be going off in the summer, and thousands of young men will cross the channel.
All right, Lee Anderson, we have to stop it there, unfortunately, because we're at the end of the programme, but from all of us here, bye-bye.